remember the sting in my arm as I stepped into the cold hallway light, the bruise already blooming under my skin. The house smelled like burnt coffee and fear, and every shadow felt like it was leaning toward me, listening. My breath came out shaky, fogging in the dim glow from the kitchen doorway. And I knew, without anyone saying a word, that something inside that home had finally broken. If you've ever ignored your instincts because you wanted to believe the best in someone, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Trust can turn dangerous in ways we never expect. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I remember the way the air felt when I stepped onto that porch in Cedar Ridge. How cold it was against the side of my face where the bruise had already started to rise. I'm 70 years old, and I've lived in Colorado my whole life. But that night felt different, as if the entire town had gone quiet just to hear what I would say. I could feel the sting in my arm, the pulsing throb behind my ribs, and the weight of what I knew was about to unfold. People looked at me with the kind of concern that borders on fear, the kind that makes you wonder what story they think they're seeing. I didn't have the strength to reassure anyone, not after what had happened inside that house, not after realizing how long the truth had been twisting itself around me without my noticing. I kept thinking about how quickly trust can turn into something sharp, something you barely recognize until it's already done its damage. But even through the ache, I felt a strange calm settling over me. I had already made the call. I knew the officers were on their way, and I knew, with a certainty that surprised even me, that someone would be leaving in handcuffs before the night was over. As I stood there on the porch, catching my breath, I felt memories tugging at me. How things used to be, how slowly everything had shifted. And that is where this really begins. When my husband passed away in Burlington, it felt as if the ground under me simply let go. We had been married most of our adult lives, and losing him was like losing the rhythm of my days. The house went quiet in a way I wasn't prepared for, especially in the early mornings when I used to hear him moving around the kitchen. I tried to keep myself busy, but grief has a way of settling into the small corners of a home, waiting for you in moments when you think you're finally steady again. In those first weeks, the loneliness was sharp. I remember wandering from room to room just to remind myself I was still here. That was when Nathan and Lila began coming around more often. At first, their visits felt like a gift. They brought dinner, helped with errands, sat with me in the evenings. I told myself it was simply kindness, the kind a family extends when they see someone they love struggling. But slowly, something shifted. I started noticing how closely they watched me, how often they asked about my routines, my bills, my health. Their concern felt genuine in the beginning, and I wanted to believe they were simply looking out for me. Still, there were small moments, little comments, lingering glances that made my stomach tighten. I brushed them aside, telling myself grief was making me oversensitive. Looking back, I can see how the foundation was already being laid, how my vulnerability made it easy for certain boundaries to blur. At the time, though, I just felt grateful not to be alone. I didn't understand that the patterns forming then would soon grow into something heavier, something that would press in on me until I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was subtle at first, a small shift in tone that I tried to brush aside. What had once felt like genuine support from Nathan and Lila slowly took on a sharper edge, as if every conversation carried an unspoken purpose. They still showed up with warm meals and careful smiles. But I began noticing how often those visits circled back to the same themes. They would remind me how quiet the house had become, how far I was from town, how unpredictable winters in Cedar Ridge could be for someone my age. I told myself they were simply worried, but the repetition gnawed at me. The pressure didn't come all at once. It arrived in bits and pieces, the way water wears down stone. I found myself hearing the same questions over and over about whether I felt safe living alone, whether the upkeep of the house was too much, whether I had thought about simplifying my life. Each time, I felt a flicker of doubt, followed by a wave of frustration that I couldn't quite name. I kept wondering why their concern suddenly felt like a script they were reading from. There were moments when their words carried a quiet guilt, a suggestion that I was putting myself at risk by staying where I was. I remember standing in my kitchen one afternoon, realizing how often I had started defending decisions I had never questioned before. That was when the unease settled in, a slow understanding that their interest in my well-being might not be as pure as I wanted to believe. By the time I recognized the pattern, the pressure had become a steady presence in my days, pushing me toward choices I wasn't sure I wanted. And that was the beginning of the path that eventually led me into their home, where everything shifted for good. Leaving my home in Cedar Ridge felt like peeling away a part of myself I wasn't ready to surrender. I remember locking the door that last morning, feeling the weight of every memory pressing against my chest. Nathan and Lila called the move a fresh start, but as we drove toward Fort Collins, all I felt was a quiet dread settling deeper with each passing mile. Their house looked warm from the outside, but the moment I stepped in, I sensed how little space there was for me. They had cleared out a small room near the back, an area that felt more like temporary storage than a place someone was meant to live. My bed barely fit, and I had to stack my boxes in the hallway until they decided where everything should go. I kept telling myself it was only an adjustment period, but the truth was hard to ignore. I didn't belong here the way I had belonged in my own home. Almost immediately, little rules appeared. I should keep my things in my room. I shouldn't rearrange anything in the kitchen. I needed to let them know if I planned to step outside, even just for a walk. They framed everything as helpful structure, but I felt myself shrinking, trying not to disrupt the rhythm of a household that wasn't mine. I tried to stay polite, to express gratitude, to convince myself I was overreacting. But every night, lying in that cramped room, I felt my independence thinning, aware that something inside this house was shifting in ways I couldn't yet name. It didn't happen all at once. The shift from discomfort to hostility crept in so slowly that, for a while, I kept trying to convince myself it was just tension or stress. But then the tone in the house changed. Lila's voice, once sugary sweet, carried an edge that cut straight through me. She moved things I needed, hid items I used every day, then acted as if I had misplaced them. I would find myself standing in the hallway, feeling foolish, wondering if grief had truly scrambled my mind more than I realized. Nathan grew distant, almost clinical. He watched from the sidelines as if he were evaluating how quickly I was deteriorating. When I stumbled on the stairs one afternoon after the railing loosened, he stood there with a calmness that chilled me. He asked if I was keeping track of my medication, even though I wasn't on any. Moments like that made me feel both angry and terrified, as though they were slowly building a case against me that I couldn't see. Then came the rough handling disguised as assistance, a hand gripping my arm too tightly, a shove masked as helping me move aside. A door closed just a little too fast behind me, every incident small enough to explain away. But together, they formed a pattern I could no longer deny. Worst of all was the gaslighting. Lila insisted I was forgetting conversations we'd never had. Nathan questioned whether I had imagined noises in the night. I felt my trust in myself thinning, leaving me frightened in a home where every glance felt loaded. By the time I lay awake one night, heart pounding, I knew the situation had crossed into something dangerous, and I realized I needed proof, any proof, to protect myself from whatever was coming next. The night I admitted the danger was real, something inside me hardened. I realized that if I kept pretending things would somehow get better, I might not make it out of that house with my dignity or my safety intact. Fear was there, sitting heavy in my chest. But for the first time in months, it pushed me forward instead of keeping me frozen. I told myself I couldn't rely on anyone believing my word alone. I needed proof, real proof. So during a rare afternoon when the house was empty, I took a quiet trip into town and bought 2 small recording devices. I remember how they felt in my hand, cold, discreet, and strangely comforting. They were my lifeline, even if no one else knew it. Around that same time, I reached out to Dr. Halston under the pretense of a routine checkup. Sitting in that exam room, I finally admitted what was happening at home. He didn't judge or question me. Instead, he helped me map out a safety plan, step by step, so I wouldn't feel like I was navigating this alone. Then there was my meeting with attorney Victor Hale. I walked into his office with shaking hands, but walked out with a clearer understanding of my rights and the reassurance that I wasn't powerless. He encouraged me to keep documenting everything, every incident, every bruise, every moment that made my stomach twist. So I did. I started recording my days, slipping the devices into pockets, drawers, and quiet corners. Every click felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. And as the evidence grew, so did a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time, the sense that a reckoning was coming. That night still feels sharp in my memory, as if every second carved itself into me. The house was strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin prickle. I could sense something building beneath the surface, a heaviness in the air that made me move slowly, as though any sound might set something off. I was in the kitchen rinsing my mug when I heard Lila behind me. Her footsteps were quick, clipped, full of purpose. Before I could turn, her hand clamped around my arm. It wasn't a guiding touch. It was a grip meant to control. Pain shot up to my shoulder, and I froze. In that moment, fear washed over me so cold I could barely breathe. I remember thinking how surreal it felt, that the woman who once called me family now held me like an enemy she needed to restrain. Nathan rushed in next. His face wasn't angry, it was panicked, like I had somehow cornered them instead of the other way around. Then I saw it. Lila had found one of the recording devices tucked behind the small kitchen radio. She held it up like evidence of a crime, her eyes wild with something I couldn't recognize anymore. They started closing in on me, not with blows, but with frantic energy. I could feel their desperation, their need to shut me down before I revealed whatever they thought I knew. Every instinct in me screamed danger. I stepped back until my ribs pressed against the counter, and that pressure snapped me out of my fear just long enough to act. My hands were shaking as I reached into my pocket and pressed the small emergency button Dr. Halston had given me. It was tiny, almost insignificant, but in that moment, it felt like the only thread tethering me to safety. The seconds that followed dragged on like hours. Lila paced. Nathan muttered under his breath. I stood there absorbing every detail, every sound, every breath, waiting, hoping that help would come before anything worse happened. And in that suffocating tension, I heard something outside that told me the night was about to break open. When the pounding started at the front door, it felt like the whole house jumped. For a moment, none of us moved. Nathan's face went pale, and Lila's hand tightened around the recording device as if she could will it out of existence. Then the door opened, and the officers stepped inside with the kind of firm presence that changes the air in a room. I could feel power shift away from the two people who had been towering over me for months. One officer came straight to me. His eyes went to the bruises on my arm, then to my shaking hands. I didn't have to explain much. I simply lifted my sleeve a little higher, let him see the marks, and told him I had been documenting everything. I placed the tiny devices on the counter, each one holding pieces of the truth I had been too afraid to speak aloud. Meanwhile, Nathan and Lila scrambled to paint themselves as caretakers caught in some terrible misunderstanding. Their voices rose, their excuses blurred together, and I watched the officers' expressions harden as they separated all three of us. For the first time in a long while, someone was listening to me without suspicion, without dismissal. The questions were gentle but direct. I answered as steadily as I could, feeling waves of relief and sorrow roll through me. I hadn't wanted any of this. I had just wanted safety. When an officer finally told me I had done the right thing, something in me loosened. I wasn't safe yet, not completely, but for the first time, I believed safety was possible. And that was the moment everything deeper, everything darker, began to surface. One of the officers pulled me aside, guiding me into the small sitting room just off the hall. His expression told me more than his words ever could. I felt my stomach tighten as he explained they had started looking through papers left out on the dining table and messages on a shared tablet. What they found wasn't random or impulsive. It was organized, deliberate. There were drafts of documents naming Nathan and Lila as my financial decision-makers, notes about selling my home in Cedar Ridge, calculations estimating how much they could access once my accounts were consolidated, even messages between the two of them discussing how much easier things would be once I wasn't living alone anymore. As if my independence were an obstacle they needed to eliminate. Hearing all of that, I felt something inside me unravel. I had spent months trying to understand their coldness, their control, their sudden insistence on taking over every part of my life. I had told myself it was stress, or grief, or some twisted form of care. But it wasn't. It was a plan. One they had built piece by piece while I was still mourning the man I had loved for more than 40 years. The officer's voice softened when he mentioned Nathan's involvement, but the words still struck like a blow. My own son, the boy I raised with every ounce of love I had, the man who once held my hand during his father's funeral. I stood there, absorbing it all, feeling the weight of truth settle on me, heavy, unyielding, but undeniable. It was devastating, but it was real. And now that it was out in the open, the consequences were finally set in motion. The hours after everything came to light felt strangely quiet, even with officers moving through the house and paperwork shuffling on every surface. Nathan and Lila were each escorted to separate patrol cars while investigators gathered more evidence. Watching them go didn't bring satisfaction, only a deep, steady ache in my chest. But beneath that ache was something I hadn't felt in months, safety beginning to return. I spent the next few hours giving statements, answering questions, and working with the officers to file emergency protective orders. It was exhausting, but for once, I didn't feel alone. Every step taken that night felt like a door closing on the fear that had followed me for so long. By early morning, I was moved into temporary safe housing arranged through a local support service. A close friend from Burlington offered to stay with me for a few days, and I accepted without hesitation. With attorney Victor Hale guiding me, I started the process of reclaiming my finances, reinstating my independence, and undoing the control Nathan and Lila had quietly built around my life. It was painful, yes, but it was also grounding. Justice wasn't swift, but it had started. And as the dust settled, I finally allowed myself to look toward what came next. Moving into a safe place felt almost unreal at first. I remember waking up that first morning and listening to the quiet, realizing it wasn't the tense, waiting kind of silence I had grown used to. It was peaceful. I could breathe again without bracing myself for whatever mood might greet me outside my door. With Victor Hale's help, I reclaimed control of my finances and every decision tied to my health and well-being. It was a slow process, but each step reminded me that my life was mine again. I started taking morning walks around the neighborhood, letting the crisp air clear the leftover fear that clung to me. I picked up old hobbies, reading on the porch, tending to a few potted plants, even trying my hand at baking again. Those small routines grounded me. They reminded me of who I was before everything became heavy and confusing. The hurt didn't vanish, but it softened, leaving room for gratitude to take its place. Gratitude for safety, for clarity, and for the chance to rebuild in my own time, day by day. I felt strength settling back into my bones. Not the loud kind, but the steady, lived-in strength that grows quietly. And as I looked toward the future, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was starting over. Looking back, I'm grateful I found the strength to protect myself, even when fear made everything feel impossible. What happened changed me, but it also reminded me that boundaries matter, and that reclaiming your life is never too late. Healing hasn't been fast, but it has been honest, and every day brings a little more peace. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever faced something that challenged your sense of safety or trust, I hope you know you're not alone. Have you lived through anything similar? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone.